to late 2000s, or the O's as some call them, were an incredibly bizarre time. The state of pop culture at this time was, for a lack of better word, emo. Just straight up emo. And with this edgelord culture of anime pretty boys in all black, Square Enix was at the forefront. The massive successes of Final Fantasy VII and later on Final Fantasy VIII gave way to the popularization of mixing modern realism with fantasy, something that was strongly influenced by jack of all trades Tetsuya Nomura. Nomura had lofty ambitions of combining elements from popular culture into titles he was working on. For example, when he was working on FF8, school dramas were popular at the time, and he suggested that the team go in that direction. He would go on to make many more titles that shared this influence, such as the highly anticipated Final Fantasy Versus 13 and the iconic 2007 JRPG, The World Ends With You. Development on the project began shortly after finishing up on Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories in mid-2004, with Jupiter, the same studio behind COM, in collaboration with Square Enix. The team was both determined and excited to create a new original IP that wasn't Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts. With the desire to do something truly new, the team had settled on the idea of the game taking place in Shibuya, something that the team initially hesitated on as they thought Western players might be turned off, which I find pretty ironic. Have you guys never seen a weeaboo before? Trust me, there's no reason to hesitate, they love this stuff. That following November, the creative team was able to get their hands on the DS during the Touch DS event. From this demonstration, they had envisioned a version of Chain of Memories in which the card game aspects would be presented on the bottom screen and be an action role-playing game on the top. As they continued to work on the game, the developers realized that they wanted to use the touchscreen more to make a game that can only be played on DS. From here, Subarashiki Kono Sekai, or as translated in English, It's a Wonderful World, was born. A title that they wouldn't be able to use in the West due to copyright issues. As a result, the localized title, The World Ends With You, was born, even though it kind of implies the opposite of being a wonderful world. I've had a chance to recently revisit this iconic game in its most recent incarnation, The World Ends With You Final Remix, a title that certainly boasts the game's Kingdom Hearts influence. Final Remix is the most definitive version of the game, though I feel compelled to mention its controls when docked rely on you playing with the Joy-Con's gyro pointer to work. This is physically the most difficult way to play the game, and what was required of me to record this footage from the Switch version to make this video, as unfortunately you can't record while in handheld mode, which did result in some frustrations, but we'll be touching on them later. As I mentioned earlier, The World Ends With You takes place in Shibuya, as you all should know, a special ward inside of Tokyo. Here, Neku and soon-to-be allies are forced to play the Reaper's game for, let's just say, survival. And I mean that way more literally than you might think, as everyone who's played the Reaper's game has already died in real life. Failing to complete the Reaper's game will result in either being erased or having to play the Reaper's game again, with the entry price being the thing that you cherish most. This game absolutely oozes style as one of its core philosophies. The pop culture influences will even have you seeing now dated slang repurposed as terminology like bling and swag being used. Playing this game nowadays and seeing Neku using a flip phone captures my nostalgic heart. Takes me back to the days when you could pull out your Motorola Razr from your skinny jeans and make all the girls around you swoon. It all just contributes to why this game is such a perfect timepiece of the era, and the developers took this as an opportunity to mix up the flavor, using Japanese fashion as the modern notion of armor, and pins in the place of weapons or abilities. These concepts would lead to some of the game's most unique mechanics. The game's engaging method of combat, known as the Stride Cross battle system, or as I call it, Tappy Tap Tap, is one of the strongest reasons this JRPG is still talked about over a decade later. As I mentioned earlier, the team wanted to make a system that was only possible utilizing the hardware of the Nintendo DS, and the result of that initial idea was an astounding success. Pins work almost in a similar way to Final Fantasy VII's materia system, as they represent unique abilities found throughout the world, or gained by completing certain objectives. Where they differ, however, is upon execution. While in Final Fantasy VII, as well as its remake, you select these commands off of a traditional command menu, whereas here in Twewy, Twewy? How do you comfortably say this acronym? I'm just gonna call it 20, like the number. Whereas in 20, these commands are done dynamically through touch gestures. For example, using your fire pin, holding a press will cause fire to ignite, burning multiple enemies. Another pin will let you tap enemies and fire a key blast. And another pin might let you pick up vehicles and surrounding debris and throw it at enemies. Ideally, you'll equip these pins in order to string together effective combos to handle enemy mobs, creatures known as the Noise. You get it? It's because he wears headphones. Oh, and by the way, there are 304 pins in the game, so feel free to experiment. And that's not the only unique thing about this combat system. In order to play the Reaper's game, you have to have a partner, and this partner joins alongside of you in combat. Just like with pins and everything else in this game, you can control them with touch gestures, allowing you to combo their attacks with your own and do so stylishly. Not to mention with this Switch version, you can play the whole game in co-op mode. The only criticism I have here is one that I foreshadowed earlier. When playing the Nintendo Switch version in docked mode, there were a ton of pins that I simply couldn't use due to the fact that certain gestures were next to impossible to do on a gyro pointer, at least for me. The Joy-Cons actually kind of changed the meta of which pins I would use. Trying to draw a circle with a godforsaken gyro pointer was next to impossible, at least for me. I have a normal human wrist, maybe you're an octopus, maybe you're superior to me. For that reason, so you can fully enjoy the game's combat system, I recommend playing it with a touchscreen, as it's a lot less of a pain that way, unless you just really like pain. I mean, I don't judge. That being said, it certainly didn't stop me from enjoying the fun and versatility of the pin system either, as well as its system for fashion, which in this game functions like armor except with a few more layers. Both the pins and the clothing that you acquire are tied to the concept of brands, and this being one of the most compelling innovations that 20 has to offer. A brand's popularity is directly tied to its efficacy, with certain brands being more popular in certain areas. However, wearing the brands that you choose in certain areas will eventually make them popular there. As a result, the player gets to feel like they're creating these trends themselves. As William Shakespeare once said, swag. The gameplay loop in this series is also fundamentally different than you'd expect from the company of IPs like Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts. Instead, you are actually on a 7-day system across 3 weeks, with each day having its own vibe and a different course of events that will play out in them. Where this differs from something like Persona, however, is that each day is more like a chapter rather than a series of decisions that you have to make about how to spend your time, which I mostly use to get extra tutoring sessions. Outside of combat, Neku also has this nifty ability to read minds, which honestly doesn't do that much, but sometimes you'll find some really hilarious meme stuff. It's also where you can scan for enemy noise and engage in battles. While exploring Shibuya itself, you'll encounter the Reapers, who are some of the most suspicious looking characters you'll ever meet. If you ever want to know who to find before the music festival starts, it's definitely going to be one of these guys. They'll usually have you complete objectives to access or re-access areas in Shibuya. Admittedly, this sometimes is a grind, even coming off somewhat as padding on certain occasions, especially when some of these tasks can be leveling up a certain pin or just grinding waves of enemies. But honestly, the vast majority of these tasks can be done relatively quickly and with ease, and as a result, they never halt the game's pacing. But whether it's exploring Shibuya, fighting in combat, or being in one of the game's comic book style cutscenes, there is one important thing you'll notice. This game's music absolutely slaps. Known for his work in dozens of other Square Enix titles such as Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy Type 0, Takeharu Ishimoto provides what I believe is one of his best scores ever, ranging from rock to hip-hop and even electronica and orchestral pieces. This soundtrack is incredible and creates an intense, living atmosphere, with many of the vocals being provided by a variety of popular Japanese artists at the time. It's a soundtrack that is bound to be stuck in your head for years to come. And while the music in this game certainly fills the world with character, the game's characters itself contribute to just how incredible this game is, although you may not get that impression at first.
Shut up! Stop talking. Just go the hell away.
In fact, Neku in general at the start of the game sounds like an old Facebook status that you cringe at whenever it pops up in your memories. While Neku will seem selfish and unwilling to be bothered at first, he honestly does have a deep and sincere care for those around him, and the way that he comes out of his shell is done in a very congruent way, particularly in his relationship with Shiki, but on an entirely different level when it comes to his relationship with Joshua. Through each of Neku's 3 different partners, you learn a different dimension to his character, ultimately fleshing him out to be a magnificent and relatable protagonist. And that's the central philosophy of The World Ends With You and its characters, that people aren't always what they seem on the surface, and that there are hidden layers to everybody. Veteran fans of the game already know this to be the case with the main party, but it's also true of the side characters. Take one of my favorite side characters, a handsome, sought-after guy best known as the Prince, who is basically a social media influencer. Wow, not saying I can relate, but initially the Prince's external shell will make him come off as the popular guy you always hated in high school. However, through his character arc, it's revealed that he wants the power of his blog's influence to be authentic about the things that he likes. And so when literal sponsors actually try to pay and buy his opinion, he'll actually brush them off unless he genuinely likes what they have to offer. And thus the power of his influence cannot be purchased, showing a duality of integrity and honesty to a character you initially thought belonged in the toolbox. While the game was incredibly well received by critics and fans, scoring a Metascore of 88 with its initial Nintendo DS release, and the game's iOS version receiving a 95, the sales of the series, on the other hand, have been an entirely different discussion. The original version of The World Ends With You struggled to even break 1 million in sales, which is why greenlighting a sequel all these years has been tough. Before the release of Final Remix, character designer and creative producer Tetsuya Nomura had this to say on the matter. "I've had a chance to attend various events in different countries during the 11 years following the release of The World Ends With You. On many occasions, I've been interviewed both by fans and the media, who have told me how much they want me to make a sequel for The World Ends With You. We've been looking for an opportunity. There were a few times we tried to get started, but time passed without it ever coming to realization. There are a number of implications behind this Final Remix version. In addition to my intention of making this my last time working with the original game, I think this is the final chance for creating a path to the next step, which I've had ideas about since the first launched 11 years ago. Many thanks to everyone for supporting ongoing efforts. As of the recording of this video, there's currently no plans for a sequel to The World Ends With You. But boy, it's not over yet. Despite this, it was recently announced that The World Ends With You will be receiving an anime adaptation. We all hope to God that it doesn't suck, but if you're watching this video in the year 2021 when the anime has released, then you'll probably already know the answer to that. There's also rumors that this could lead into a sequel of the game, allowing us to see Neku and his friends once more, and not just inside of dream job distance. But ultimately, The World Ends With You is an unforgettable piece of art that captures the essence of the era that it was born into. It's essentially a must-play JRPG for its unique and innovative ideas that still haven't been quite replicated in the same way ever since. And ultimately, its daring nature is what makes it so unforgettable. So if you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. And if you have played it, I hope you enjoy this nostalgia-filled video. And if videos like these mean a lot to you, be sure to check out the Patreon for the Night Sky Prince, where all these videos are made possible by people like Amber Loringer. So if you're like Amber and value what I do here on the channel, please be sure to check the link in the description below. Shout out to Amber and the rest of the Ultima community.
Every